I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Rahima Karatella, Jazakallah for having me. Week on week, Rehana.
Oh no, it's been our pleasure. I know you've been juggling many responsibilities, work and family, especially during the Easter holidays, and you've still turned up, so may Allah reward you abundantly.
Ameen.
Yeah, Ameen.
And you.
Oh, Ameen. Jazakallah. Now, before we start, I've got a couple of requests and announcements, because what generally happens is, Rahima, we run out of time, don't we?
We do.
So my requests are for du'as. So my dear friend Yasmin Surati from FMO sadly lost her mum yesterday. An amazing woman who's been blessed with the month of Ramadan. Can we please all make lots of dua that Allah elevate her ranks in Jannah, Ameen, and give her family, Yasmin and her daughters and everybody else, all her loved ones, husband, everybody, the sabr and patience and what they need to cope with this terrible loss, Ameen.
Ameen.
Secondly, may I request that we all make dua for all those people out there who are unwell. Allah give them shifa, Ameen. In particular, our parents, if they're alive, and anybody else. So on that note, I wanted to just request that we make dua for my mum, Allah give her shifa, and also my niece who has been in hospital since the beginning of Ramadan. May Allah Ta'ala give her shifa, Ameen, and she is reunited with us very, very soon. And anybody else that is not unwell, may Allah give them shifa, Ameen. And I wanted to say a huge thank you to the Ramadan radio team who have been supporting us throughout this month. May Allah reward Sabiha Musa, Brother Akil, Brother Yasser, and Sister Zainab, and all the other people behind the scenes that we don't even see to make
Day
this,
in, day out,
make this radio
hard.
work. May Allah reward them all. Ameen. I didn't want to leave it till the end, because what happens is we run out of time. So today's focus is men's mental health. And we have got in the studio Brother Salim Mangera, who we are going to speak to in a little while. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
How are you?
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah so much for joining us today. And via Zoom, because we have this wonderful technology, we have got Rahima. Do you want to introduce who we've got with us?
Assalamu alaikum, Shirin.
Walaikum salam. Are you okay?
How are you this morning?
Good, alhamdulillah. Yeah, how are you?
Alhamdulillah, well. We
Good.
look forward to chatting to you.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm going to get Rahima to speak to Shirin later on, and I'm going to start with Brother Salim. So before we get really into our show around men's mental health, I just want to read out a statistic. In England, around 1 in 8 men has a common mental health problem, such as depression, anxiety, panic disorder, or obsessive compulsive disorder. Perhaps Shirin can later on maybe highlight a tiny little bit on those, just so that people understand. I think the word depression and anxiety is bandied around a lot, but the panic disorder and the OCD perhaps not so much. So it would be perhaps a good idea just to explain that a little bit. So maybe later on, Shirin. And research shows that men are less likely to access mental health support. And 3 times as many men as women die by suicide. And the highest rate of suicides in the UK is men aged between 40 and 49. I'm going to leave that there right now and come back to it in a little while. So let me tell you about my guest. Right, so Brother Salim Mangera has been involved in bereavement services in Leicester for more than 20 years. Subhanallah. And Brother Salim's expertise, knowledge and experience came to assist our local communities during the pandemic. So responding to the COVID-19 threat in early 2020, he facilitated a coalition of local mosques and community organizations across the community to build additional capacity within the community to deal with the deaths resulting from the pandemic. Because listeners, we know that as a Muslim community in Leicester, we were greatly affected. This coalition, along with the city's Muslim funeral directors, doctors, clinicians, professionals, and community workers, came together to form COVID-19 Leicestershire Muslim Funeral Support. Brother Salim has many years of experience of working with communities, particularly older people and he has been involved in interfaith work for a very long time. So, and I know that this is how Crescent Funerals came about. So, Brother Salim, I wanted to ask you a few questions, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Lovely. Right. So, tell me a little bit about how you got involved in this work.
I originally came from London. I settled in Leicester in 2004, excuse me. I lost my father in 2003 in London, so that was my first experience with, close-up family bereavement. The Muslim trust that I was working with at the time had a funeral service, so we used that for my late father. And that was my first experience with bereavement. And really I saw how and what was involved. And since then, I've more or less been involved in funerals and bereavement services.
Subhanallah. So out of tragedy, you decided to help other people. That is amazing, Brother Salim. And may Allah, grant your father Jannat al-Firdaus. Ameen. And it's funny how we've connected again because of the loss of my father.
Absolutely.
And I know Crescent Funerals and you yourself gave us great support. May Allah reward you. That was about a year and a half ago now. And if it wasn't for your services, I think we would have struggled even more. So we're really fortunate that concerned members of the community came together very quickly and facilitated what we needed as a Muslim community. So that's fantastic. So tell us briefly about your current work and how Crescent Funerals came about.
So I've been, as you mentioned, I've been in bereavement services for almost 20 years. 16 of those were spent with the Burial Council in Leicester. I left the Burial Council in 2019 and actually stepped away from bereavement services,
Take a break?
Take a break, a change. So I went into general practice for a few months.
Whoa.
I didn't take to it very well. Obviously, the mindset's different, and I was more used to a different kind of environment and working kind of ethic. So I then basically stepped away from that in early 2020 and semi-retired. So I took on, as you would do, things that you left behind in your past.
Yes.
So I'm a biker, so I went biking,
Mashallah.
fishing, that kind of thing. So I did all those things, DIY and whatnot. This was around the time that COVID-19 was first being, looked at seriously in Asia and so on, and it's making its way across the world. And it was also a time when I was still involved in funerals, because obviously spending 15, 16 years, you develop a relationship with people, and people did still continue calling. So it was that time that I actually established Crescent Funerals to work independently. It was important for me to be independent.
Yes.
Because of my working relationships with various communities within Leicester, it was difficult if you were affiliated to one particular organization. So it was important that it was independent in every sense.
And I think that's a really good point when we're working in these fields, because we can get labelled as one thing, and very quickly that reputation. Oh, you're like for me, you're Ansar. That's it.
Absolutely.
And then to get away from that, it was really, really difficult. So I totally understand.
Yeah. So it was around that time that we set up Crescent Funerals. A couple of months later, we came closer to the pandemic, and it was creeping up. And I was approached by a few brothers concerned about what we had in place if and when the pandemic sort of really hit us as a community. And a few of us sort of came together, put our heads together and began working. I was tasked with bringing the mosques on board, the main ones.
Okay.
And alhamdulillah, without hesitation, I must say, they stepped up.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah.
I think if I can mention them, if that's
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Jami Masjid on Ashbury Street, Central Mosque on Conduit Street,
MashaAllah.
and Masjid Nur on Berners.
SubhanAllah.
All of them, mashallah, I must say, really did give us the strength that we needed. So, you know, they opened their doors up to allow the group, as it was growing, to train our young members for ghusl, kafan, and all of that.
So the volunteers got training,
Yes,
because obviously there was
absolutely.
specific training needed for obviously dealing with deceased
Yeah.
who had been had COVID. So
Yeah,
obviously, so it was very different to the normal training.
Yes, it was it was a very uncertain time, because a lot of the guidance that was coming out was not accurate. So we had to take every precaution. So PPE training was given by our clinicians, mashallah. Jami Masjid opened up their ghusl khana for the training of youngsters in ghusl and kafan. The first COVID ghusl actually took place at Jami Mosque.
Wow.
Central Mosque, mashallah, opened its doors, allowed and gave permission for the car park to be used for a temporary mortuary if we needed one.
SubhanAllah.
Also a temporary bathing facility for COVID-only deaths,
Yes.
which was later relocated elsewhere.
Yeah.
Masjid Nur also, mashallah, trained up their volunteers to take off some of the burden
Yes.
from the very limited services that they had. But the mosque did an absolute fantastic job of giving us and the volunteers the extra confidence to you know, and the courage to continue. And alhamdulillah, they did a brilliant job. Leicester City Council as well, I must
MashaAllah,
say, with the cemeteries department. I mean, these chaps at Saffron Hill worked in scorching temperatures just to allow us to have the extra burials.
May Allah reward
working
them
longer
all. Ameen.
Yeah, that was when the first wave happened. The second wave was in the winter months.
Yeah,
They were freezing
in the
cold
cold.
temperatures, and they were still working. So hats off to all of them.
Yeah, and I
mashallah.
think sometimes we don't know what goes on behind the scenes, and I just wish I had more time to talk about all of this, but unfortunately I don't. But I mean, it's amazing when a community comes together, when you know, people put their hands up and say, right, okay, what are we going to do about this? So people like yourselves, volunteers who are concerned,
Absolutely.
and then organisations, communities, community centres, mosques, leaders all get together.
Yes.
It's amazing what we can achieve.
Yeah.
Yes,
In that
subhanallah.
in that instance, we dropped a lot of barriers that we keep
Mashallah.
us from progressing.
Yes, yes.
And that still continues, alhamdulillah.
And may, you know, long may it continue. I mean, you know, and that unity is really important. So subhanallah, that's really good. Now, working in bereavement services, obviously you see a lot of people who are going through a very difficult time in their life, you know, because one of the worst things that can happen to you is that you lose a loved one. So grief, you know, bereavement is one of, it has a huge impact on people's mental health. So how do you, you know, kind of manage that? Because you're exposed to it as volunteers. How do you take care of your own mental health, and how do you support or signpost these people?
It takes a lot of patience.
Okay.
Dealing with bereaved family members, in many senses, is a calling. It's not for everybody. You'll notice when you ever meet a registrar of births and deaths, and you go to register a death, they have a very particular demeanor, approach. They're soft-spoken. They choose and say the right words. So it's very difficult for us sometimes to maintain that in our community. You know, we can become desensitized.
Yes.
And it's a huge risk for funeral directors such as myself and other people who arrange funerals, that they are mindful they don't become desensitized.
Yes.
Because the slightest heavy sigh, the wrong word can really cause deep offense to bereaved family members. So we have to be mindful of that. We also are exposed, like you said, to their trauma.
Yeah.
In many instances, we have to be strong as much as possible. We do get emotional. I specifically get very emotional, and it's a good thing in a way, but it's also sometimes impedes what you need to get done in the time that you've got to get it done in.
Yes.
So we are careful. In terms of how we deal with it, we try and comfort them as much as possible. Reassurance is a huge part of that. Reassuring family members that everything will be okay. we take calls at all hours. I mean, I
Wow.
get calls at 2 a.m,
Yes.
and all they're really looking for is somebody to say my loved one's passed away.
Yeah.
All they're really looking for is somebody to say to them, don't worry, it'll be fine. We'll pick it up in the morning or whenever, and we'll deal with it. And they really want somebody just to say, you know what, I'm behind you, don't worry, we'll be fine.
Subhanallah. So it's not just the practical side. There's a lot of emotional support
Absolutely,
involved,
there
that
is.
empathy, but it can have an impact on you. So, Brother Salim, are you still doing the fishing and the cycling to take care of yourself?
Well, cycling I do take out. I'm a fine weather biker, so it's only when the sun comes out. You enjoy that time for yourself while you're on the bike.
Yeah.
And it is time to reflect, time to think as well. So I do that. Fishing, I've not been able to go fishing because last year we were awarded the out of hours contract by the City
Mashallah.
Council. So that takes up a lot of my free time now.
But I hope that you are investing in your self-care. And I
I
know
am.
that as a support network, the volunteers most probably support each other.
Yes.
But even maybe getting some professional support,
Yes.
because support isn't just about when we are struggling. It's investing to make sure that we are resilient
Yes.
and able to deal with all the challenges. I mean, and I'm not dictating that to you.
No.
I'm kind of like, it's a Rehana, practice what you preach for myself, because I've had a lecture the other day about this,
Okay.
because we absorb other people's pain.
Yeah.
And obviously there is a comeback on that.
Yes, there is.
Okay. As a man yourself, and from your professional experience, what do you think are some of the factors that may impact on men's mental health?
I mean, obviously, you've got the day-to-day worries that every individual has, man or woman. It could be to do with work commitments, work pressure. It could be domestic issues, all sorts of things. But from my professional experience, I would say, funerals bring up a unique kind of stress and pressure on an individual. In the Muslim community, as Muslims, I mean, the men take a more active role in funerals. So if they're already having the normal day-to-day pressures and then all of a sudden they suffer bereavement, it's a very emotional journey that they undertake through, obviously, as a cause of their loss. And on top of that, having to then deal with funeral arrangements, family, community dynamics, and that kind of thing. It can add to that stress already.
Yeah.
So for me, I find a lot of people do suffer in that period. And this is why we try and comfort them and reassure them as much as possible to try and reduce that pressure that they're under.
Yeah.
But that does eventually, if it's not managed correctly, can lead to mental health issues.
And are you then able to signpost individuals?
We try to. I have tried this for a number of years in trying to. I mean, what ends up happening is because of that relationship you build with the individual over a period of time, they latch on in some instances.
Yes, very quickly.
I've had many instances where they've actually come to the office and they've sat and they've literally just broke down. It's a sad situation. I really do sympathize.
Yeah.
But we try and signpost them to individuals that we may be aware of. The GP generally was a safe bet. But we really, we've discussed this in the past. It's one of the things that I really want to do as a project is to provide bereavement counselling, bereavement,
Inshallah.
support at some stage, inshallah.
Really,
so it would be
really
helpful.
Yeah, definitely, Rehima. And this is something perhaps our listeners out there may be listening and maybe get in touch with Brother Salim, but also we will catch up about this as well.
Inshallah.
So in your experience of working and supporting bereaved families, do you think there are any additional barriers for men from Muslim, particularly from ethnic minority communities?
It depends how you approach that. Ethnic minorities, if they've been resident in the city or the country for a number of years, the difficulties and the barriers are drastically reduced because they're aware of the systems that we have in place.
Okay.
If the family is a new arrival, the processes that we have in place are alien to them.
Yes.
The cultural practices they had back home are difficult to then find in this country. So quite often my first questions when I do get referred by individuals or families who have suffered bereavement who have these kinds of barriers is to ask them a few basic questions about, who they're affiliated to, which country they come from, is there any specific, community that they will need to be getting in touch with, and we signpost them, and then we make sure that they're looked after.
Inshallah.
So language is a problem, most definitely. Not understanding the current processes that we have in place and the legalities is definitely a problem. And cultural issues. I think you need to be sensitive to people's cultural requirements, because dictating to them, no, this is not possible, that is not possible, doesn't always help the situation, especially when you're talking to a bereaved family.
No, absolutely. So how do the rest of the volunteers manage their mental well-being when they're dealing with death? Because obviously it's a very difficult area. And also, with grief-stricken families, I know I've asked you, but what about the volunteers? How do they manage it? Are they supported by you, I'm assuming?
No, volunteers are a great bunch of people, honestly. I mean, these people put themselves in harm's way for the benefit of our loved ones that we need to put to rest over the 2-year period. And they were there with, obviously, the ground staff for burials. They were there for the bathing and shrouding, and so on, obviously in teams. But I think as a group, they talk to each other.
Excellent. So they support each other.
It's a good way of bouncing your concerns off each other. They are strong in that sense. But I think generally they're a tough bunch.
So they're resilient, and the attitude.
I think the approach is more from a religious aspect that they approach the work, and that gives them that additional strength. That whatever they're doing is for a higher purpose, and that gives one any individual strength. When you can accept that, it gives you strength.
Jazakallah so much, Brother Salim. Rehima, before we move on to our second guest, have you got any questions for Brother Salim?
No, I'm just really in awe of the work that you do. But maybe I may be interested in volunteering with you, and there might be some other listeners out there who may also be. So, please, where shall we put your website link?
Please do
on the Facebook page.
If you can. There are a lot of resources on the website. It's very informative, especially for families who are expecting bereavement. There are a lot of guidance there as well, and hopefully I have personal involvement in the website, so we build as we go along. The projects we've discussed in the past are still there.
I think
they just need to be.
Yeah, and kind of just to add to that, I think there's a need for more women to be in that domain, because absolutely. I remember when my nanny passed away, my uncles were in a period of shock, my mamas, and they were like, no, can you do it? So literally I had gone at 8 o'clock in the morning ready to register her death, speak to the coroners, visit the, get the death certificate, hand it over literally to the people, to the grave diggers. And I went through that process, and it was one that I'd never imagined doing.
Exactly.
But
I can tell you for a fact that the women that I've encountered over the years who've been involved in the funeral process are far more efficient and assertive in getting the job done. I'm serious.
Subhanallah.
They don't take no for an answer, which sometimes is helpful. And
I literally remember saying to them that no, I want this 2 o'clock slot for my grandmother's burial. It's going to happen. And there was a mistake with the certificate with the GP. He had written the cause of death wrong. And when I rang him, he said he was on his way to the airport. I said, you better come back because you need to sort this out.
Subhanallah. Well done, Rehima. Okay, shall we move on to our next guest, Shirin Sidat? I mean, there's a little intro there at the bottom.
Shirin, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
So, Shirin is a trained and experienced humanistic and integrative therapist, a counsellor, psychotherapist, and clinical supervisor. Shireen's also an associate of Baines Ball Counselling and Psychotherapy, and Shireen's experience includes trauma, grief counselling, couples counselling, and so much more. Shireen, Jazakallah for being with us today. And, you've obviously mentioned about grief and bereavement just now, and there may be some parts that you want to touch on from this previous segment, but please tell us briefly about some of the current work that you're involved in and what made you pursue this career path as well.
Well, I've always had an interest in mental health and psychology. I did psychology at college, and that really, really sparked my interest. And then from there, kind of continued and found a really great training program for counselling and psychotherapy, which kind of led me to this point, to the work I'm doing now as a therapist.
And so what, in regards to the kind of conversations that we were having before about Muslim communities and specifically men's mental health, what do you think are some of the factors that are most likely to impact on men's mental health?
Yeah, so some of the things are already mentioned previously, like by Brother Salim as well. Like, I think, and this isn't to say that all men experience these things or have these values or feelings, but that a majority of people still, I think, have worries and concerns about this idea that I should be able to do it, I should be able to get on with it. Men don't have feelings, or that they only have very specific feelings, and if they do have other feelings, unless branded as sensitive or weak. So that's kind of what
macho image.
Yeah, absolutely. What it means to be a man.
Keep up.
Yeah, absolutely. The ideas of masculinity, and I know that so there's a lot of work out there right now that is being done to maybe some kind of dismantle some of the toxic ideas of masculinity, but ultimately change so that people can get support, that it's normalized and validated that men are human beings who have feelings, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Do you think other communities do that better than we do within our kind of Asian, specifically Muslim communities? Do you think men within our community are less likely to access support and help?
I think it does depend on the individuals. I think there's probably a lot more specific barriers than that. Muslim communities might face, specifically to maybe cultural understanding or cultural rules within families, and community rules that maybe other communities might not face, or they might just face different ones.
So it's those kinds of barriers that we really need to be breaking down. And as you mentioned, it's sort of an education, isn't it?
Yeah. So when we're living in a society where often men are expected to be the breadwinners and to be strong and dominant and in control. And, these aren't inherently bad things, but they can make it harder for men to reach out for help and open up. Yeah. And even if they're struggling, they could be struggling for years with anxiety or depression. They won't go for any help. So they may end up developing, bad coping strategies. So that's quite common. Shireen, would you agree?
Yeah, definitely.
And that could involve alcohol and drugs and things like that as well, because they haven't got an out. They haven't got. They're unable to say, what's wrong. So now, how do they keep it? How do they mask it? How do they carry on? So,
and what other? Just kind of thinking in lines with that, where people may take up addictions to be able to hide the signs that they're struggling. Are there any other kind of more obvious signs, specifically within men, where things that you might have already seen? There's the addictions. Is there any other things that you can kind of pinpoint from the work?
Typically some of the behaviors are, and again these are quite general. So aggression, violence, things like self-harm, suicide is much, much higher in men. And that's obviously, I think, why there is a lot more of a focus on men's mental health and trying to overcome some of the barriers so that we are educating ourselves, we are, increasing our awareness of the specific barriers that men are facing and how we might best support them as a community, as people, as women, and how we might, instead of adding to the harm, reducing the harm and creating safe spaces, so where emotional needs can get met and people can talk, and not feel, and I think start to shift this idea of talking, or admitting or just saying that they are struggling is a bad thing or is considered weakness. And we want to shift that. Yes. We want to shift that idea and say that actually, no, there's a lot of strength and courage in talking. It takes a lot to be able to talk and share your experiences and to be vulnerable with another person or be vulnerable with your family. That's not an easy thing to do, and that there's spaces here. Definitely. We want to create spaces that encourage that and that continue to encourage that.
Totally agree. And Shireen, on that, I just wanted to say, and when that is not happening for people, even in our own communities, often people, particularly men with mental illness, are living on the fringes of the community. We see them, but people don't call them, people ignore them, or they pity them.
Or they're labelled.
Yeah, or they're labelled, there's so much stigma and shame around it, and it's really sad. So I think us talking about this now and continuing to focus on men's mental health, I think is really, really important. Do we have a comment? Rehima, do you want to read that out?
How can we best support someone who is suicidal?
Shireen, do you want to answer that?
I think one of the most important things is to take it seriously.
Okay.
I think sometimes our fear can get in the way, or if we're unsure about how to manage it, and we can feel panic naturally. But taking it seriously is always a good shout. Listening. Obviously, depending on the situation, what the level of risk is at that point, then getting police or ambulance or GP involved. Emergency services are always a good point of call at that point. But if somebody is feeling suicidal, might not intending in that moment, then providing a listening ear is a huge, huge important thing that could change things. Feeling like that they're being listened to, that they're being heard, that they're not alone, that they're not struggling alone, that they matter.
So, Shireen, this attitude often that happens in our community is the dismissiveness, the judging, and the telling off that this is haram and this is wrong. And, I just think that we have got a long way to go, because when people are that desperate and that on the edge, remember, mental illness is an illness like anything else. It is not, they're not always in the right frame of mind. They are unable to see clearly. It's a very vulnerable situation. So it's not helpful. In fact, we push people further into that hole by, judging them and telling them off. So I think there's a lot of work to do around that, particularly if we talk about men's mental health. Brother Salim, I just wanted to bring you in there just about suicide. So I read out the statistic that men aged 40 to 49 have the highest suicide rates in the UK. And although more women attempt suicide, more men are successful. Would you say that includes the Muslim community?
I would. Sadly, I would.
Yeah, so we need to be very realistic, because often sometimes what happens is we kind of say, oh no, that's happening in that community, not in our community. We don't have this issue, but we do. So we all need to educate ourselves. Would you agree, Rehima?
Definitely. I know of some situations myself within extended community members where Muslim men have taken their lives.
Yeah, and the same for me. And again, who are we to judge? Brother Salim, I'm sure you would agree with me. At the time of death, we are not witness to how that person's soul has been taken. So it is not for us to judge that, this and this, because there's been very sad cases where people have not attended funerals and made a judgment. And it's really upset me.
It's hurtful. It's painful. And I think, mental illness manifests itself in various ways. And I think if people... I'm not an expert, but just going by what people have talked to me about is mainly trying to recognize the out of character traits that people develop after a trauma and something like bereavement. And I think people need to learn or maybe be advised of what to look out for following bereavement.
Yeah, so Brother Salim and Shireen, I remember recently reading a statistic about bereaved families who have lost a person to suicide are more likely, are at higher risk of committing suicide themselves.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's
Shireen
right.
will know.
Yeah, that's right. Certain traumas like that can bring up feelings of suicide and ideas of suicide, and just increase that further. It's very common that feelings, it might. I'm not quite sure what the statistic was around attempted suicide and the amount of deaths after that, but definitely thoughts increase whenever we are faced with trauma like that, or really, really difficult situations like bereavement. And a lot of the times, some of that, our suicidal ideation in that sense comes from a real sense of hopelessness and powerlessness and helplessness, and feeling isolated and not quite sure what to do, and that the pain that you're in is so overwhelming that it's indescribable, and unless you've been there, it's really hard to describe it to people, and that increases the isolation. And a lot of why suicide might come as an idea, that it's not an intentional thing. It's not, oh, here's a great idea. It's actually, I don't know what else to do. I don't know how this pain is going to stop. Oh, unless actually, dying might actually stop this pain. And that could be across the board with other coping strategies like self-harm as well. Right, what's going to make this pain stop?
Shireen, we've got a question, so I'm just going to pause you there on that, because obviously we had a message through to say, how can I help my son, recently diagnosed with psychosis and schizophrenia? After 2 hospital admissions, he's now using street drugs to manage his feelings. How can I help my precious son? I understand it's an unhealthy coping strategy.
Yeah. It's a really difficult
deep, isn't it?
one. I mean, depending on obviously the situation, I'm not quite sure, who's involved in terms of psychiatrists and doctors, and maybe kind of liaising with them and seeing what support, more of a holistic approach might be needed. There might be some organizations out there that might be able to support, particularly with psychosis and mental health, but there is a huge lack of resources and funding, and so obviously you might hit barriers there as well.
There is a drugs support project.
That you might be able to
rehabilitation
specific drug projects. Then that might be the way to go.
What I would add to Shireen's advice is that as a mother, the fact that you are concerned about your mother, your son, and you love him is an amazing thing. Unconditional love for your child, regardless of the decisions he is making right now. Keeping the door open and dialogue going, that I am here for you no matter what, so that he will turn to you, whether that's now or later. Obviously, you're making du'as for him, and we will continue to make du'as for him as well. May Allah assist him and guide him. May Allah grant him shifa, ameen. May Allah give him all that he needs to get better, ameen.
And just also know that actually you're not the only. There's lots of other mums just like you who are in a desperate state of worry for their children, who are mixing their mental health and drugs. And actually it's kind of even worse than to get a diagnosis, because lots of psychiatrists may say this is drug induced, and it's even more difficult to get a clear-cut diagnosis with this. We've had another message come through. So I wanted to say thank you for speaking about topics like this and raising awareness, especially in communities so close to home. We need more change on the stigma that is around mental health, and to educate the elders as well as the youngsters that it's okay to share their feelings. And we will kind of mention Jazakallah for your support today, and we will in our kind of last few minutes in our concluding remarks give you some tips to go away with and how you can engage with your family. And so Shireen, kind of you've been really inspiring, enabling us to kind of share your journey with us. If there's others out there who are interested in getting involved in a similar career to yourselves, what would you what tips or career advice would you give them?
Definitely look for a good training institute that provides you with some really good robust training. Having therapy yourself, always a very important part of this profession, because obviously, very much like Brother Salim was saying, that we're impacted by other people's pain and other people's trauma, and it's a term that we call vicarious trauma, that we kind of live a little bit through someone else's story, and so obviously taking care of yourself is really, really important. So kind of having a look out there what kind of training there is, and see if it fits with who you are and how you want to practice and what you want to do. I don't know if that answered your question.
That's perfect. Jazakallah, Shireen. And also to kind of say that you're within the counselling directory yourself, and Shireen Sidat. So Jazakallah, if people want to kind of look into you further, then that's how they can kind of find out. We've had a couple of messages in, some good mental health charities out there, Mind and Samaritans, definitely. Yeah. And I guess with some of the tips that we want to leave our guests.
Sure. Rehima, I just had a question before you start. So Shireen, very quickly, we mentioned panic disorder is common in men, and obsessive compulsive disorder. Could you just give us maybe in 2 sentences briefly? Obviously our listeners can do their own research, but what those 2 terms mean.
Panic disorder is a little bit different from anxiety in terms of that it's regular panic attacks. Okay. Someone who is regularly having panic attacks, and what was the other one? OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder. 2 parts to that. So it's the obsessive, so repetitive thoughts, and reoccurring thoughts over and over again, and also then the compulsive side, which is part of the behavior. So repetitive behavior, and both of those things are out of the control of that person, that it happens and they're not able to control those thoughts or those behaviors. So
in our women's mental health show the other week, I mentioned that the most common disorders were anxiety, depression, and self-harm. So for men, it is anxiety and depression, but then it's panic disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. There's a slight difference there.
1 in 8 men as well, Rehana.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Will go through either panic disorder, OCD, depression, or anxiety. So it's
Brother Salim, do you have any tips for our listeners?
A personal one to say, value the time that the Almighty has given us. Spend it with your family as much as you can. Confide and support each other as much as you can. From my professional perspective, I would say if you are in a situation where you find yourself close to somebody who might be passing away, seek advice, come and speak to us. We're available every day, all hours usually. And just seek the advice, and take the advice. It'll save you a lot of heartache as and when the time comes.
That's wonderful advice. Jazakallah so much. Jazakallah for joining us in the studio. Jazakallah to our listeners. Jazakallah to Shireen. I'm going to let Rehima finish off at the end now.
Well, just to kind of say, for anyone who you think may be struggling with their mental health, do check in with them. Just ask them how they are. Don't be afraid to ask more than once either. Just be that annoying person and just listen to what they have to say. Ask if they're okay. Make sure you listen to them, and if they tell you what's on their mind, you don't have to have all the answers or give advice, but just listening is really valuable. Just reconnecting with them, making plans to catch up, knowing that they've that they have someone who cares makes all the difference. Jazakallah to